In May 1951, Iranian officials entered the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's installations at Abadan, the refinery complex that had opened in 1912 at 120,000 tons a year and grown into the largest in the world, with pipelines, tank farms, workshops, and loading berths tied to a single foreign-controlled operating chain. The immediate risk was institutional rather than rhetorical. If Tehran could not replace company management, preserve output, and keep crude moving through the lower Karun and the Shat al-Arab approaches, it would lose revenue, invite British countermeasures, and demonstrate that legal nationalization did not yet equal operational control. The rupture occurred in southwestern Iran in 1951, but it condensed half a century of conflict over who commanded extraction, refining, transport, and the coercive apparatus that protected them. The system under examination is therefore not oil in the abstract, but a connected regime of concession law, field development, refinery operation, pipelines, export terminals, fiscal transfer, foreign credit, intelligence coordination, sanctions, and armed enforcement. The stakes were direct: sovereignty over subsoil resources, access to foreign exchange, regime stability, class power in an oil enclave, and the capacity to finance armies, police, subsidies, and patronage. The issue still mattered in 2025 because Iran remained a hydrocarbon state whose survival depended on moving crude and refined products through sanctions pressure, maritime evasion, and regional conflict, while using oil income to sustain both state administration and institutions of coercion. Abadan also exposed the social architecture that had grown around the industry. The refinery sat amid a compartmentalized company city in which housing, services, and space were organized by rank. Workers' districts, managerial suburbs, company clubs, and the bazaar were physically and socially segregated. By the mid-20th century, tens of thousands of employees depended on the refinery, while the urban order around it reproduced hierarchy and foreign managerial power. Nationalization was therefore not only a legal act against a company. It was a contest over payrolls, maintenance schedules, marine access, labor authority, and the right to decide how revenues generated in Kazakhstan would be distributed in Tehran. The British government, for its part, treated the enterprise as a major strategic asset, not a normal private concession. From the beginning, Iranian oil generated a recurrent mechanism. A technical network built for extraction gave outside powers leverage over law, transport, and finance. Iranian governments then sought to recover control through cancellation, renegotiation, nationalization, or administrative substitution. Those efforts triggered embargoes, covert intervention, or internal repression, and each settlement created a new institutional layer rather than a clean break. Abadan in 1951 revealed the core problem with unusual clarity. A state could proclaim ownership of fields and refineries, yet still depend on foreign shipping, engineering, insurance, and market access to turn oil into usable sovereignty. To understand why that dependence endured, one must return to the concessionary order built in the first decade of the 20th century. A further point often missed in simplified accounts is that the operational vulnerability of Abadan was inseparable from the administrative weakness of the Iranian state at the point of takeover. The refinery depended on trained staff, spare parts procurement, tanker scheduling, and a transnational commercial network built under foreign management. Nationalization therefore posed an immediate policy conflict between popular demands for swift sovereign action and the practical need for continuity in highly specialized industrial operations. The inability to resolve that contradiction quickly would feed the embargo, deepen domestic conflict, and set the stage for the coercive solutions that followed. The concession granted to William Knox D'Arcy in May 1901 did more than authorize drilling. It gave exclusive rights for 60 years to search for, exploit, transport, and sell petroleum and natural gas across most of Iran, together with the right to build pipelines, depots, factories, and the other works needed to run the concession. That bundle of rights mattered because it transferred not only access to underground resources, but control over the infrastructure that would connect wells to the Gulf. In return, the Iranian government received a modest cash payment, stock, and a promise of 16% of profits. The asymmetry was built into the contract. Private foreign capital obtained operational command over territory, logistics, and accounting before the Iranian state had the administrative capacity to verify costs, output, or transfer pricing. Commercial oil was struck at Mashti Soliman in May 1908 after years of failed drilling and heavy expenditure in southwestern Iran. The site was remote, the terrain difficult, and the venture financially fragile. Yet once marketable oil appeared, the institutional problem changed decisively. Oil could not be monetized at scale without pipelines to the coast, refining capacity, marine loading facilities, and secured communications across Kazakhstan. Abadan was chosen because it lay near navigable waterways and could receive ships through the Shat al-Arab approach. A pipeline linked the fields to the island, and the refinery opened in 1912. On its first test, it broke down, and the venture nearly collapsed for lack of working capital, which underscores a point often obscured by later geopolitics. Infrastructure, not merely geology, made the concession viable. The British state quickly recognized the strategic implications. Churchill's 1913 Memorandum on Fuel Supply for the Royal Navy led the British government to seek a controlling interest in Anglo-Persian, and by 1914 Britain had become the major shareholder. This move tied Iranian oil to imperial naval planning and converted a concession into a strategic security asset. Thereafter, Iranian claims about royalties or labor conditions were never handled as purely commercial disputes. They were filtered through British concerns about maritime fuel security, Gulf routes, and the vulnerability of a state that had proclaimed neutrality yet could not defend its southern oil zone from foreign leverage. The infrastructure of oil thus widened the meaning of foreign intervention long before formal occupation or covert action entered the picture. The early oil order in Iran therefore combined three durable features. First, the legal concession handed outsiders authority over extraction and transport. Second, the technological system of wells, pipeline corridors, telegraph links, refinery units, and port facilities created a narrow geography of dependence in Kazakhstan. Third, the fiscal design left the Iranian state with revenues too limited and too opaque to support equal bargaining. Those features did not remain static. They generated labor unrest, provincial security concerns, and repeated attempts by Tehran to insert itself into contracts, taxation, and oversight. The next phase was not immediate nationalization, but the slower discovery that oil could build a stronger state only if the state first broke the institutional logic that oil itself had created. Russian opposition to southern outlet rights was significant from the outset, because a concession without assured pipeline access to the Gulf would have been commercially weaker. The exclusion of the northern provinces from Darcy's concession did not reduce the geopolitical importance of the agreement. It clarified that oil rights in Iran were already embedded in great power rivalry before the first major strike at Mashti Soliman. That early entanglement helps explain why later Iranian efforts to revise contracts were never treated by outside powers as ordinary commercial negotiation. During the interwar decades, the oil industry in southwestern Iran ceased to be a distant concession and became a territorial system. Abadan's refinery expanded from 1 million tons in 1918 to 5 million in 1930 and 10 million in 1939, while the company enlarged its landholdings and built a highly stratified urban complex around the plant. The refinery's location near river and maritime approaches and the movement of crude by pipeline from the interior meant that a relatively narrow corridor of fields, pumping installations, dock facilities, and worker settlements carried disproportionate national importance. Yet the institutions governing that corridor were still largely external. Senior management remained expatriate, accounting remained inaccessible, and the state's dependence on royalties left it vulnerable to swings in company calculations and world demand. This was the setting in which Reza Khan and then Reza Shah sought centralization. Oil did not initially dominate government revenue, but it mattered because it offered the possibility of cash income independent of landed intermediaries and provincial notables. The trouble was that the state could not command that revenue on its own terms. Iranian officials increasingly objected to the company's accounting practices and to the mismatch between company profits and royalties received in Tehran. At the same time, labor unrest in the oil regions showed that infrastructure could not be separated from public order. In July 1946, after the war, but rooted in grievances that had accumulated earlier, A general strike by oil workers ended in violence and British forces were deployed near Abadan. The industry required police, intelligence, and military backstopping, and that fact sharpened the question of whose force was actually securing Iran's most valuable asset. Abadan's company city made the politics visible. Planned worker housing, managerial suburbs, segregated amenities, and the refinery's empty buffer zones produced a spatial hierarchy that contemporaries described as colonial. In 1943, refinery employees numbered roughly 25,000. By 1948, they reached 39,000, about one-third of the city's population. The bazaar and surrounding neighborhoods absorbed those excluded from company privilege and became sites where criticism of the oil order could circulate. Oil therefore shaped class formation not only through wages but through urban design, migration, literacy, and daily access to services. That mattered politically because nationalist claims later drew strength from the gap between the enormous scale of extraction and the visible inequality of the enclave that extraction had built. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Tehran's response was increasingly legal administrative. Iranian negotiators pressed for revised terms, better payments, and greater oversight. The company resisted anything that threatened its managerial autonomy or the profitability of its integrated operations. The conflict was moving from localized resentment to a dispute about sovereignty embedded in contracts, taxes, and control of information. Reza Shah's attempt to revise the concession would become the first major state effort to break that structure from above, but it would also show how limited Iranian leverage remained when the infrastructure, technology, and export channels stayed in foreign hands. Communications and transport reinforced this dependence. Telegraph supervision in Kazakhstan and the broader integration of oil operations into British commercial and strategic networks meant that information as well as petroleum moved through infrastructures partially shaped from outside. As the central state expanded under Reza Shah, it confronted not a simple extractive enclave, but a coordinated system of communications, transport, and industrial management that could not be nationalized by decree alone. The conflict over oil was already a conflict over state formation. The crisis of 1932 was triggered by numbers, but concerned power. When royalties due to Iran for 1931 fell from more than £1.28 million to about £306,872, the decline far exceeded the drop in company profits, convincing Iranian officials that the concession system allowed the company to shift the burden of market downturns onto the state. Reza Shah canceled the Darcy concession in November 1932. Yet the settlement that followed in 1933 exposed the structural constraints of oil nationalism before nationalization. The new agreement reduced the concession area and guaranteed a minimum annual payment of £750,000, but it also extended the concession's duration and left operational control with the company. In formal terms, Iran gained revisions. In institutional terms, it remained dependent on a foreign-operated export machine. The 1933 settlement mattered because it taught several lessons that would reappear later. First, cancellation alone did not guarantee control if the state still lacked engineers, tankers, market access, and independent audit capacity. Second, oil contracts could stabilize revenue while still entrenching foreign command over production and pricing. Third, once Britain had tied Persian oil to naval and strategic needs, every contractual dispute was shadowed by the possibility of political pressure. During the 1930s, discoveries at additional fields and the continued growth of the refinery increased Iran's material importance without proportionately increasing its autonomy. Oil could strengthen the central state, but only through institutions that the state did not yet fully possess. World War II and its aftermath deepened the contradiction. Iran's proclaimed neutrality did not shield it from occupation, supply corridor politics, or renewed great power bargaining over petroleum. British concern with maintaining access to southern oil converged with broader wartime logistics. After the war, the Soviet demand for a northern oil concession intensified nationalist opposition to all foreign oil privileges, not only those claimed by Moscow. British officials understood the danger. Their own records noted that rejection of Soviet claims could easily provoke scrutiny of the Anglo-Iranian arrangement, especially when taxes paid by the company to the British government exceeded by more than double the sums received by the Iranian government in 1947. The concessionary order had become politically indefensible even when it remained commercially functional. The policy response in Tehran was increasingly legislative. The law of October 1947 committed the government to renegotiating the 1933 concession. This shift was crucial. Oil ceased to be treated as a diplomatic irritant and became a constitutional question about the relation between parliament, cabinet, and executive authority. Once that happened, every failure to revise the bargain strengthened forces that argued only nationalization could align resource control with sovereignty. The move from contract revision to outright expropriation was not inevitable, but the practical alternatives were narrowing. What followed was a mass political struggle in which labor, parliament, foreign pressure, and legal argument converged around the fate of the oil industry. Yet the 1933 agreement also had a paradoxical state-building effect. Stabilized royalties helped the central government expand administration, but precisely because the revenue arrived through an externally managed concession, it strengthened the state without fully freeing it. This pattern would recur later. Oil income could fund centralization while simultaneously preserving the external constraints that made political sovereignty incomplete. The constitutional and parliamentary arguments of the late 1940s emerged from that paradox, not from abstract anti-foreign sentiment alone. When Mohammad Mossadegh became prime minister on April 29, 1951, and oil nationalization followed 2 days later, Iran moved from bargaining over royalties to asserting exclusive authority over the entire operating chain. The issue was not merely ownership of underground reserves. It was the right of the state to take over fields, refineries, ports, and export sales from a British-owned enterprise whose installations in Iran formed Britain's largest overseas investment and a major source of sterling oil. In law, the claim rested on sovereignty and parliamentary legitimacy. In practice, it required Iran to replace company management at Abadan, retain skilled personnel, market crude without access to the old distribution networks, and prevent foreign powers from turning technical dependence into regime change. The British response was to transform an administrative takeover into an international siege. London challenged nationalization through diplomacy and legal pressure, withdrew personnel, and used its influence over shipping, insurance, and purchasing to isolate Iranian oil. The result was the Abadan crisis, a nationalized industry with enormous fixed assets, but rapidly shrinking capacity to monetize them. Economic hardship followed not because oil had disappeared, but because the channels through which oil became foreign exchange were externally vulnerable. Iran could control valves, tanks, and refinery gates on its own territory. It could not easily compel tanker companies, foreign refiners, or global traders to treat its crude as normal commerce. Nationalization thus clarified the distinction between possession and circulation. Domestic politics tightened under these pressures. Mossadegh's coalition included constitutional nationalists, segments of the bazaar, labor activists, and religious figures whose cooperation was never stable. Administrative strain mounted as oil income collapsed. Supporters of nationalization expected social justice and sovereign dignity. Opponents pointed to lost revenue, inflationary pressure, and the danger that state paralysis would invite either military intervention or communist advance. The practical motive of many foreign policymakers was not hidden. U.S. and British officials increasingly tied any post-crisis stability to an oil settlement that would restore production, reassure markets, and anchor a government considered reliable. The oil dispute had become inseparable from the question of who would govern Iran and by what means. What made the crisis decisive was that each side relied on a different conception of capability. Iranian nationalists believed political legitimacy and formal ownership could force recognition of a new order. Britain acted on the assumption that control over markets, finance, technical expertise, and covert networks could outlast legal expropriation. Neither assumption was wholly false. Iran proved it could nationalize and mobilize. Britain proved that an oil industry cut off from export channels and credit could be made economically punishing. The confrontation therefore shifted from legal contestation toward administrative attrition and, increasingly, toward covert political options. The practical administration of nationalization was therefore burdened from the first day by incompatible timelines. Parliament and the street demanded immediate assertion of authority. Engineers, traders, and treasury officials needed time, technical continuity, and external customers. Britain exploited that gap by making circulation harder than possession. In this sense, the Abadan crisis was a demonstration of infrastructural power. Whoever could interrupt marine insurance, tanker access, refining outlets, and credit could redefine the meaning of sovereignty without retaking the installations themselves. By late 1952 and mid-1953, the oil crisis had become an administrative war of endurance. Exports remained crippled, foreign exchange was scarce, and the government faced the contradictory demands of constitutional legality, social mobilization, and fiscal survival. Oil workers and refinery staff were no longer the only constituency that mattered. The state needed customs receipts, budget financing, urban price stability, and a means of paying for routine administration without the normal inflow from petroleum. Economic distress did not simply weaken Mossadegh mechanically, but it narrowed his room for coalition management. Every month that Abadan remained disconnected from its old commercial circuits strengthened those who argued that nationalization without a settlement was exhausting the country faster than it was disciplining Britain. The legal and constitutional arena was equally unstable. Mossadegh's use of emergency powers, his conflict with the court, and his efforts to subordinate the armed forces to elected authority were defended by supporters as necessary under siege and denounced by critics as steps toward concentration of power. This was not a secondary dispute. Oil revenue financed the military, and command over the military was indispensable in any state that hoped to defend a nationalized industry under embargo. The monarchy, parliament, cabinet, senior officers, and street organizations all understood that resource sovereignty depended on coercive sovereignty. The conflict was therefore not between economic policy and politics. It was over whether a constitutional nationalist government or the palace military axis would control the institutions needed to govern an oil state under external pressure. British and American policy discussions tracked this logic with unusual bluntness. A State Department memorandum from November 1952 recorded that the British Foreign Office was prepared to attempt a coup d'état if Washington would cooperate, and it linked the viability of any successor government to rapid political and financial support and to the early conclusion of an oil agreement. The memo is revealing precisely because it joins coercive change of government to restoration of petroleum flows. The issue was not only anti-communism, though that mattered in Cold War calculations. It was also the judgment that no durable political order in Iran could be built, from the Western perspective, without reattaching Iranian oil to a structure acceptable to Britain and the United States. This combination of embargo, constitutional conflict, and covert planning transformed the nationalization struggle into a test of state capacity under isolation. Iranian resistance exposed the illegitimacy of concessionary control, but it also revealed how dependent post-colonial sovereignty remained on finance, shipping, expertise, and recognition beyond formal law. The next step was no longer renegotiation in the ordinary sense. It was the direct use of covert intervention and domestic force to replace a government that had nationalized oil but could not break the infrastructure of pressure surrounding it. Resistance to Mossadegh remained fragmented, but fragmentation favored covert action because it made no single constitutional channel decisive. Street mobilization, palace intrigue, clerical maneuver, and military uncertainty interacted with the oil embargo in ways that steadily weakened the possibility of a negotiated domestic settlement. The economic siege did not mechanically cause the coup, yet it created the conditions in which covert intervention could plausibly be represented as restoration of order rather than outright reversal of popular sovereignty. In this sense, the coup was prepared by a mismatch between the territorial reality of nationalization and the international reality of oil commerce. Tehran held the installations, but its opponents retained decisive leverage over monetization, coalition fracture, and military opportunity. Once that imbalance became politically internalized, the constitutional order could be overturned with less resistance than the popularity of nationalization alone might suggest. The overthrow of Mossadegh on August 19th 1953 resolved the immediate crisis by force, not by constitutional settlement. Iranica's concise formulation remains useful. The coup that ended the confrontation begun by nationalization was conceived by MI6 and delivered by CIA. The political result was the restoration of the Shah's position and the destruction of the broad alliance that had linked parliamentary nationalism to social mobilization. The administrative result was equally important. The state that emerged after the coup was reorganized so that oil revenue could flow again under a framework compatible with foreign participation, while domestic opposition would be contained by a tighter security order. Coercion and petroleum were rejoined at the institutional core. The 1954 Consortium Agreement did not simply reverse nationalization. It created a hybrid structure in which Iran retained formal ownership through the National Iranian Oil Company, but a consortium of foreign firms resumed the effective functions of operating, marketing, and distributing Iranian oil. Anglo-Iranian, now moving toward BP, received a 40% share. American companies took another 40%. The balance went to other European firms. Oil resumed flowing, compensation questions were settled, and the world market was reassured. Yet the price of resumed production was institutional compromise. The very industry nationalized in 1951 returned to operation through a multinational arrangement designed to restore export reliability while muting the political meaning of foreign control. The domestic political consequences were immediate. Parties were banned, newspapers were closed, the National Front and Tuta networks were repressed, and the monarchy acquired room to expand executive power. The creation of SAVAK in 1957 institutionalized the lesson learned by the post-coup regime. Oil income could stabilize the state only if intelligence, policing, and surveillance neutralized movements capable of disrupting that income or challenging the political settlement around it. CIA and later Mossad training relationships, along with working-level intelligence exchange, bound the security apparatus to international alliances even as the regime projected sovereign modernization at home. Oil did not merely fund the security state. The security state secured the conditions under which oil rents could be centralized. The post-coup order therefore converted the failure of one form of nationalism into the success of another, narrower form, a state-centered developmental monarchy that claimed modernizing sovereignty while restricting mass political participation. The contradiction was postponed, not resolved. Iran now had greater revenue, planning capacity, and access to world markets. But it also had a settlement rooted in foreign intervention and dependent on repression. Those two facts would shape the next 2 decades of growth, centralization, and mounting inequality. The new settlement also redefined the meaning of NIOC. It survived as the legal expression of national ownership, but the most commercially valuable functions remained constrained by the consortium framework. That institutional compromise helped the Shah claim that nationalization had been preserved in principle while ensuring that the external market and the Western alliance system could trust Iranian output again. The bargain restored cash flow, but it also embedded the memory that sovereignty could be recognized formally while curtailed materially. The post-coup state thus solved one problem by institutionalizing another. It restored production and revenue, but it tied those gains to a regime whose legitimacy was weakened by the memory of foreign intervention and by the suppression of legal opposition. The durability of the arrangement depended on whether oil finance development could outpace that legitimacy deficit. After 1954, resumed oil flows gave the Pahlavi state a materially stronger base than any Iranian government had previously possessed. The key change was not only higher income, but the routinization of revenue transfers into state planning. The first development plan had faltered badly. With the return of oil activity, the government adopted a new planning framework more consistent with increased petroleum income under the consortium arrangement. During the second plan, the plan organization gained a larger role in directing public investment, especially toward transport, dams, and infrastructure. Oil thus shifted from a contested concession to the fiscal foundation of developmental authoritarianism. Budgetary resources no longer moved mainly through ad hoc bargaining with a foreign company. They were increasingly centralized through state agencies whose legitimacy rested on growth, order, and visible modernization. The social geography of this order remained uneven. Abadan and the wider Kazakhstan complex still concentrated extraction and refining, while Tehran concentrated allocation. The company town's hierarchical structure was gradually nationalized in personnel terms, but not fundamentally democratized in social logic. Urban migrants, refinery workers, technicians, civil servants, and the expanding middle classes all depended in different ways on oil-funded institutions, yet benefits were distributed asymmetrically. The regime's answer was not participation but managerial expansion backed by coercive capacity. SAVAK's creation in 1957 and the widening surveillance of nationalist and leftist opposition meant that oil-fueled development and political closure advanced together. The security apparatus did not stand outside modernization. It was one of its enabling institutions. Technological development also changed. Natural gas that had long been flared began gradually to enter a more deliberate industrial strategy. By the 1960s, gas processing, petrochemicals, and associated infrastructure expanded under NIOC and joint projects, including facilities at Mashhur and Karg. Karg Island became the principal export terminal, linked by submarine pipeline from Gaxarin and equipped with tanks, berths, and later offshore loading capacity for very large tankers. Here the oil state acquired a more diversified physical base, fields inland, refinery and petrochemical installations on the coast, and a high-capacity export node in the Gulf. The strategic advantage was scale. The vulnerability was concentration. A handful of corridors and terminals carried national solvency. By the early 1960s, the monarchy had therefore built a more capable revenue state, but it was not yet a stable one. Oil-financed infrastructure and elite integration, while repression contained overt dissent. What it did not do was create representative institutions capable of mediating distributional conflict. The more successful the state became at centralizing rents and projecting development, the more severe the eventual backlash would be when growth slowed, inequality widened, and citizens demanded control over a system that asked for obedience in exchange for state-led progress. The White Revolution and related reforms should therefore be read partly through the oil lens. Land reform, education expansion, and infrastructure projects were presented as developmental modernization, but their feasibility depended on centralized rent extraction and on a security apparatus capable of overriding entrenched opposition. Oil-financed reform from above, not social bargaining from below. The regime's promise was that planning plus repression could replace representation. That promise worked for a time because revenue rose faster than the social contradictions it generated. The decisive shift of the 1970s was that Iran moved from participating in a foreign-led consortium to asserting much greater command over its oil industry and over the price environment in which that industry operated. The 1954 arrangement was replaced by the 1973 Sale and Purchase Agreement, under which the consortium members surrendered management and control in return for privileged access to Iranian crude. The revenue consequences were dramatic. Iranica notes that oil income during the 1954 agreement amounted to $16.2 billion for cumulative production of 459 billion barrels between 1955 and 1973, whereas income after the 1973 arrangement aggregated $104 billion for 284 billion barrels from 1974 to 1978. Oil had become not merely the fiscal base of the state, but the accelerator of its ambitions. Those ambitions were administrative and coercive at once. The state expanded procurement, infrastructure, welfare promises, and military spending on a scale that few domestic institutions could absorb. By 1978, oil revenues accounted for about 63% of the government budget after peaking at 86% in 1974 and around 80% of foreign exchange receipts. This dependence encouraged centralization in Tehran and magnified the political consequences of every planning error. The regime could import technology and arms, launch capital-intensive projects, and imagine itself as a regional power, but it also tied legitimacy to continuous material performance. Rising income did not remove social conflict. It intensified it by widening disparities, accelerating migration, and reinforcing the sense that a narrow ruling coalition monopolized the benefits of national wealth. The physical oil system expanded with the new revenue. Kharg Island handled around 90% of exports, and its facilities were built to move up to 3 million barrels a day, including via offshore terminals for supertankers. Gas reinjection and large-scale field programs were planned to sustain pressure and increase recovery in the southern fields. Petrochemical and refining projects multiplied, yet the same concentration that gave Iran leverage in the market also increased exposure. A state whose foreign exchange, budget, and development model depended on a small number of Gulf export nodes and on a rapidly expanding bureaucracy would be acutely vulnerable to strikes, sabotage, war, or prolonged shipping disruption. The stronger the oil state became, the narrower its operational margin for disorder. That contradiction shaped the final years of the monarchy. Oil wealth underwrote military procurement and security services, but it could not compensate for the political costs of exclusion, censorship, corruption allegations, and uneven development. The regime had solved the old problem of foreign managerial control more effectively than Mossadegh had been allowed to do. It had not solved the domestic problem of legitimacy. When unrest escalated in 1978, the industry that had funded authoritarian modernization would become the mechanism through which that modernization was brought to a halt. For the monarchy, this was the moment when control over oil seemed finally to vindicate authoritarian modernization. Yet success created new bottlenecks. Capital-intensive projects outpaced bureaucratic absorption, military purchases outpaced institutional oversight, and inflationary and distributional pressures outpaced the state's capacity to translate wealth into durable consent. Oil abundance strengthened executive autonomy, but it also insulated the regime from feedback until opposition became systemic. A rent state can postpone correction precisely because it can purchase time. In the late 1970s, Iran discovered that purchase time is not the same as resolved conflict. The revolution of 1978 to 79 was not caused by oil alone, but the collapse of the monarchy was materially accelerated by oil's interruption. Demonstrations, riots, martial law, and elite fragmentation eroded confidence across the country. Yet the decisive economic pressure came when oil and industrial workers entered general strike. U.S. documentation recorded that by December 27, 1978, all exports had stopped, and by the next day oil production was at a standstill. That operational fact mattered more than any abstract market signal. A monarchy that depended on petroleum for budget revenue, imports, military expenditure, and the maintenance of an immense patronage and security apparatus could not survive a prolonged stoppage in its main cash-generating sector. The strike succeeded because it acted on choke points rather than on ideology alone. Fields in Kazakhstan, the Abadan refinery, pumping installations, port labor, and the wider industrial workforce formed a chain in which disruption at several nodes could immobilize the entire export system. The regime could impose censorship and martial law, but it could not easily run a complex hydrocarbon industry without technical personnel and labor cooperation. Nor could it quickly substitute coercion for the social consent needed to sustain production under revolutionary conditions. The Pahlavi state had spent decades using oil revenue to strengthen intelligence, military, and police institutions. In late 1978, it discovered the limit of that strategy when the revenue machine itself became politically disobedient. The Islamic Republic inherited the damaged apparatus. The revolution purged or displaced many managers, officers, and technocrats associated with the old regime, while revolutionary committees, militias, and new clerical institutions competed for authority. The hostage crisis beginning in November 1979 further reoriented the state by intensifying anti-American mobilization and helping the new rulers eliminate liberal and secular rivals while consolidating the institutions of the nascent republic. Oil revenues remained indispensable, but the political logic of allocation changed. The new state linked rents more explicitly to revolutionary legitimacy, redistribution, and war preparation rather than to royal modernization and Western alliance. The alliance with the United States was terminated. The need for oil income was not. The immediate consequence was not sovereign calm, but heightened vulnerability. The state had been transformed faster than the industry could be reorganized. Administrative continuity was incomplete, foreign relations deteriorated, and the military-security balance was unsettled just as a hostile regional environment was hardening. Within months, Iran would confront a war that turned oil infrastructure itself into a battlefield and forced the new republic to learn how to govern under bombardment, blockade risk, and fiscal scarcity. This episode also linked the memory of 1953 to the revolutionary future. Many opponents of the Shah interpreted the stoppage of oil as the corrective to a state rebuilt after the coup through foreign-backed oil revenues and domestic repression. In that sense, the 1978 strike was both an economic weapon and a historical verdict on the post-coup order. The Islamic Republic would inherit that memory and would thereafter treat labor unrest in strategic sectors as a direct threat to regime survival, not a normal social conflict. Revolutionary power therefore entered office with a strategic memory of infrastructural disruption. Whoever controlled production schedules, refinery labor, and export terminals could precipitate a state crisis much faster than parliamentary opposition could. That lesson would shape the Islamic Republic's later treatment of workers, ports, and strategic industries. The Iran-Iraq War began on September 22, 1980 with Iraqi air raids against major Iranian airports and a ground invasion across several fronts. For the oil state, the significance was immediate and concrete. Iraqi forces entered Khuzestan, the Abadan refinery was destroyed, and both sides began attacking oil installations from the start of the conflict in order to damage each other's production capacity. Iran's principal export architecture, southern fields, refining capacity, Gulf terminals, pipelines, storage tanks, and tanker routes, was suddenly exposed to sustained military pressure. What had previously been a vulnerability of concentration became a wartime reality. A state that had already undergone revolutionary purge now had to defend its solvency by improvising repairs, rerouting exports, and preserving enough throughput to finance survival. Karg Island was central to this wartime economy. Since the early 1950s, it had developed into Iran's principal export terminal, handling about 90% of exports and equipped with pipelines from inland fields, storage tanks, jetties, and offshore loading capacity for very large crude carriers. Because of that concentration, Karg became a strategic target. The war's tanker, dimension, and repeated strikes on shipping and terminals were designed not simply to damage property, but to cut the opponent off from foreign exchange. Iranian adaptation depended on dispersal, repair, air defense, convoying, and the constant balancing of military necessity against the technical requirements of loading and export. The war thus made visible how much of modern sovereignty depended on engineering resilience under fire. The domestic consequences were equally important. Oil rents that in the 1970s had financed modernization and arms purchases were redirected toward a war economy, rationing, and revolutionary consolidation. The state tightened control over labor, distribution, and dissent, while invoking sacrifice to compensate for shortages and institutional strain. Revolutionary organizations, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, gained importance because coercive loyalty became as necessary as technical competence. The war did not eliminate the need for oil expertise, but it subordinated that expertise to a security logic. Infrastructure repair, procurement under sanctions, and continued export from damaged facilities all required a new alliance among ministries, state companies, military bodies, and informal channels. An instructive feature of the conflict is that attacks on oil installations did not produce a sustained global oil shock, even though they were central to both state strategies. This fact reinforced a hard lesson for Tehran. Iran's oil mattered enormously to Iran, but global markets could adjust more readily than Iranian public finance could. The Republic therefore emerged from the war with a heightened appreciation of resilience, redundancy, and strategic depth, yet also with damaged infrastructure, exhausted finances, and a security establishment whose political weight had permanently increased. The next stage would be reconstruction, but reconstruction would occur under sanctions, debt pressure, and the institutional afterlife of wartime coercion. War also changed the hierarchy of institutions inside the Republic. Ministries, state companies, and technocrats remained necessary, but organizations better suited to emergency mobilization, clandestine procurement, and ideological discipline gained leverage over decisions that in peacetime might have belonged to civilian administrators. That shift had long-term consequences for the political economy of oil because it normalized the involvement of security bodies in logistics, contracts, and strategic industry. The post-war republic did not demobilize completely from that mode. The post-war years did not restore the pre-revolutionary oil order. They produced a reconstructed security rent state. Under Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, rebuilding Abadan, reviving damaged fields, repairing terminals, and restoring transport links were framed as national economic priorities. Yet reconstruction unfolded under hard constraints: lost capital, technological bottlenecks, limited foreign financing, and a state apparatus in which wartime institutions had gained durable influence. The strategic objective was clear. Iran needed enough production and export capacity to stabilize the currency, finance reconstruction, and rebuild administrative legitimacy without surrendering the autonomy won at immense cost. The practical means were more complicated. Tehran sought foreign expertise and investment selectively while protecting political control over the commanding heights of the sector. Natural gas and petrochemicals became more important in this phase. Long-delayed reinjection plans, gas gathering, and downstream development were revived because mature southern oil fields required pressure support and because gas offered a way to widen the energy base beyond crude exports. Later EIA assessments show the long arc of this strategy. Iran's dry natural gas production rose sharply over the 2013 to 2023 period, and by 2023 South Pars and related gas developments had made gas central to domestic energy use. The roots of that shift lay in the post-war recognition that a state vulnerable to external pressure needed domestic fuel substitution, petrochemical value-added, and reduced dependence on imported products. Reconstruction therefore concerned not just damaged wartime assets, but the architecture of sanctions resilience. At the same time, the coercive dimension of the state was not rolled back. The post-war republic retained wartime patterns of surveillance, ideological vetting, and selective repression, even as it pursued more technocratic economic management. This continuity mattered because the new oil strategy required labor discipline, controlled distribution, and the containment of political forces that might turn economic hardship into an organized challenge. Iran's rulers had learned from both 1953 and 1978. They would not allow either a foreign-backed reversal of resource sovereignty or an oil sector stoppage that could quickly deprive the state of revenue. Public legitimacy was sought through reconstruction and welfare, but it was always reinforced by institutions able to police the terms of dissent. During the 1990s and early 2000s, this mixed system showed both strength and fragility. Iran retained substantial reserves, rebuilt parts of its refining system, and improved its capacity to manage fields and exports, yet it remained dependent on foreign technology, exposed to sanctions, and politically constrained by the growing role of security institutions in the economy. The result was a state more autonomous than the monarchy in formal control of oil, but still structurally vulnerable in finance, investment, and international integration. That vulnerability would become much sharper when nuclear politics, U.S. sanctions expansion, and regional conflict began to reshape the energy-state nexus in the following decade. For this reason, the post-war settlement is best understood as adaptation rather than liberalization. Reconstruction required technocratic competence, but the leadership never accepted the proposition that economic opening should weaken revolutionary control over strategic sectors. Oil and gas policy were made to serve both growth and regime security. That dual mandate encouraged selective foreign cooperation, extensive domestic substitution, and the continuing empowerment of institutions able to operate under political risk. The result was a more repair-capable state, but not a more open one. From the mid-2000s onward, Iran's oil question was redefined by sanctions architecture as much as by geology. Nuclear diplomacy, U.S. and European restrictions, banking constraints, insurance barriers, and shipping sanctions did not eliminate production capacity overnight, but they altered every step between wellhead and revenue. The problem was no longer simply how much oil Iran could produce. It was whether cargoes could be insured, paid for, transported, blended, relabeled, or settled through channels that escaped enforcement. Administration and law returned to the center of the story. Executive orders, secondary sanctions, blacklists, and compliance rules became instruments for regulating access to tankers, dollar clearing, marine services, and refinery customers far beyond Iranian territory. Iran adapted by diversifying intermediaries, deepening links with Asian buyers, and relying more heavily on state-affiliated or opaque commercial networks. The IRGC's broader economic role expanded in this environment because sanctions raised the value of entities able to operate across formal and informal channels, manage procurement risk, and absorb legal ambiguity. Regionally, oil revenue continued to intersect with military and geopolitical strategy. Tehran's support for allied armed actors and its involvement in Syria, Iraq, and the Gulf were not financed by oil alone, but hydrocarbons remained essential to the foreign exchange base that made such policies sustainable. Sanctions, therefore, had a double effect. They constrained the economy while also increasing the relative importance of institutions specialized in evasion, coercion, and cross-border security operations. The JCPOA temporarily altered this configuration by reopening some export and banking possibilities, but the U.S. withdrawal in 2018 restored the centrality of sanctions evasion. EIA's 2024 country brief shows the scale of the shock and the subsequent adaptation. Crude oil and condensate exports fell to around 0.4 million barrels per day in 2020, then recovered to nearly 1.4 million by 2023, with China taking nearly 90% of those exports in 2023 and about 1.5 million barrels per day in the first 8 months of 2024. The structure of dependence had changed. Instead of a diversified customer base, Iran increasingly relied on discounted sales routed toward China, often through intermediated or obscured destinations. Revenue returned, but on costlier and more politically contingent terms. This period also revealed the domestic limits of the rent state. Sanctions constricted fiscal room, inflation and currency pressure eroded household security, and protests repeatedly exposed the gap between regional ambition and internal legitimacy. Yet the state did not abandon its hydrocarbon strategy. It doubled down on resilience through discounts, barter, petrochemical exports, and tighter domestic policing. By the early 2020s, Iran had built a sanctions-adapted oil order in which survival depended less on reintegration into normal markets than on the managed opacity of shipping, finance, and coercive governance. The final phase of this story would show both the effectiveness and the limits of that adaptation. A striking consequence of sanctions was the relocation of critical decision-making from visible price setting to hidden logistics. Questions of blending, ship registry, port rotation, re-export labeling, and payment routing became as important as field productivity. This changed the distribution of power inside the state and its allied commercial networks, rewarding actors able to manage opacity and legal risk rather than transparent efficiency. Sanctions thus reshaped not only Iran's external trade, but the internal sociology of the oil economy. The result was a paradoxical strengthening of certain state capacities under pressure. Iran became better at concealment, rerouting, and selective substitution even as sanctions reduced efficiency and long-term investment. A state can learn resilience from punishment. It can also be deformed by the techniques that resilience requires. The early 2020s demonstrated that sanctions resilience was real but expensive. Total petroleum and other liquids production rose from under 3.0 million barrels per day in 2020 to about 4.0 million in 2023, of which almost 2.9 million barrels per day was crude oil. Yet EIA also noted the underlying constraint. Sanctions had restricted foreign investment, leaving Iran to rely on local companies that lacked the capital and technology needed to maintain mature fields efficiently. Projects awarded from 2019 onward progressed slowly, even as Tehran pushed redevelopment in the southwestern fields and new contracts in West Karun along the Iraqi border. Adaptation preserved output. It did not remove the structural penalty imposed by isolation. Refining and transport strategy reflected the same pattern. As of early 2024, Iran's crude distillation capacity was estimated at 2.1 million barrels per day, with 0.6 million barrels per day of condensate splitter capacity. The Persian Gulf Star complex had increased gasoline output, and a new 210,000 barrel per day unit was added at Abadan in 2023. At the same time, old and inefficient refineries still left Iran reliant on some gasoline imports, and sanctions hindered completion of planned upgrades. Transport policy likewise aimed at reducing vulnerability to the Strait of Hormuz through the Gawar-Jask pipeline and the Jask export facility east of the strait. But by mid-2024, the line's nameplate capacity of 1 million barrels per day translated into only about 300,000 barrels per day of transport capacity, and export use remained limited. The bypass existed more as strategic insurance than as a fully realized alternative. Domestic energy stress sharpened the political problem. EIA reported that power shortages and rolling blackouts had affected residential and industrial users almost every summer since 2020. In 2023, peak summer demand exceeded supply by 12 gigawatts, while drought and water shortages constrained hydropower. This matters for oil politics because an energy-rich state that cannot reliably provide electricity undermines its own developmental narrative. Subsidized fuel, rising domestic consumption, aging infrastructure, and sanctions delayed investment turned resource abundance into a governance paradox. Citizens experienced not geopolitical leverage, but blackouts, inflation, and shortages. The response was a combination of technical adjustment and intensifying coercion. The UN fact-finding mission reported in March 2025 that the state had expanded surveillance, policing, digital restrictions, and mandatory hijab enforcement under the Noor Plan, while mapping the roles of the IRGC, Basij, Ministry of Intelligence, Faraja, Special Forces, provincial governors, and the judiciary in the repression of dissent after the 2022 protests. This is crucial to the energy state nexus. Oil revenue no longer bought broad consent as in the high-rent 1970s. Instead, it helped sustain a more security-centered regime that compensated for economic strain with monitoring, selective punishment, and institutionalized fear. By 2025, the question was not whether Iran could still sell oil. It was whether oil could still purchase enough legitimacy to reduce the need for repression. Even where technical progress occurred, it did not dissolve political tension. New wells, refinery units, and contracts in West Karun could slow decline rates or raise capacity, but they could not address the legitimacy costs of inflation, surveillance, and declining trust in the judiciary and police. The state's answer was procedural rather than representative. More monitoring, more selective prosecution, more reliance on security agencies mapped by the UN mission. Oil still financed adaptation, but adaptation increasingly meant governing scarcity and dissent, not distributing confidence. By 2025, the long afterlife of coups, war, and sanctions had produced a distinctly Iranian form of hydrocarbon sovereignty. Formally national, operationally adaptive, fiscally indispensable, and permanently securitized. OFAC's April 2025 advisory estimated that Iran was exporting roughly 1.6 million barrels per day of crude oil and 0.4 million barrels per day of refined petroleum products by sea, with Karg Island still accounting for around 90% of seaborne crude loadings, Bandar Mashar leading refined product exports, and Bandar Abbas following behind. The same advisory described the shadow fleet on which this system increasingly relied. Older, poorly maintained vessels, opaque ownership structures, repeated ship-to-ship transfers, falsified cargo documents, AIS manipulation, and shell companies used to disguise origin and destination. Iran had preserved export capacity, but it had done so through a logistics model that was costlier, riskier, and more fragile than normal market integration. Official U.S. actions in 2025 illuminate the connection between oil revenue and coercive power inside Iran. Treasury's March 2025 sanctions on petroleum minister Mohsen Paknejad stated that some 200,000 barrels per day of crude were allocated to the Iranian armed forces, that these allocations were set to rise sharply, and that by the end of 2025, more than half of Iran's total oil revenues were expected to be allocated to the armed forces. Whether or not one accepts every political premise of Treasury's framing, the institutional point is clear. By 2025, the state was channeling hydrocarbon income directly into the bodies responsible for internal order and external projection. Oil no longer merely funded the government in general. It increasingly underwrote the specific organizations that police society, secure borders, and manage regional confrontation. The regional context made this fusion more pronounced. In June 2025, according to the UN fact-finding mission, Israeli airstrikes caused extensive casualties and damage inside Iran, including a strike on Evin prison, after which the government intensified domestic repression. By mid-August, Iranian authorities claimed to have arrested 21,000 suspects. Parliament adopted legislation expanding the death penalty for espionage-related offenses, and the mission reported intensified surveillance, arrests of minorities, and a return of morality police patrols. In October 2025, the same UN body warned of a serious deterioration of human rights, an extraordinary spike in executions, and the persistence of a recurring system of repression underpinned by impunity. Oil mattered here not as a detached revenue stream, but as the financial substrate of state endurance during external attack and internal crackdown. The measurable long-term outcome is therefore mixed. Iran has far more formal control over its oil than it did under Darcy, Anglo-Persian, or the 1954 consortium. It has sustained production, rebuilt refining, expanded gas use, adapted exports toward China, and learned to operate under sanctions. Yet the price of that sovereignty has been high dependence on opaque shipping, discounted sales, security institutions, and recurrent repression. The coups of the 20th century taught Iranian rulers that foreign powers would use oil to shape the state. The crises of the 21st taught them that the state would answer by fusing resource administration ever more tightly with coercion. By 2025, oil still anchored Iran's war capacity, sanctions resilience, and regional posture, but it no longer resolved the problem that had haunted the country since Abadan. Control over the resource had been nationalized, while legitimacy, prosperity, and political consent remained profoundly contested. That is why the legacy of oil and coups in Iran cannot be reduced to a simple loss or recovery of sovereignty. The decisive historical mechanism was the repeated conversion of resource vulnerability into institutional redesign. Concessionary dependence led to nationalist mobilization. Nationalist mobilization triggered coup and consortium. High-rent monarchy produced centralized coercion. Revolution and war securitized the industry. Sanctions then rewarded opacity and military-linked networks. The contemporary Iranian state bears the accumulated imprint of all these layers.